Inspired by the reading related to the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, we were encouraged to look at another convention of the United Nations which focused on the rights of another often overlooked group of people, persons with disabilities. This topic was chosen because of its significance in acknowledging and adapting the future of human rights for such a large group of individuals who have been neglected for centuries. Eric Posner's first chapter in The Twilight of Human Rights Law, in which he mentions the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, provided an interesting starting point for our research. In this chapter, Posner mentions that many developing countries played a dominant role in the negotiation of disability rights, whereas developed nations had to be dragged along. This question of why certain nations were more likely to support the implementation of the UNCRPD led to the discovery of two separate models for disability rights around the world, the medical model and the social model. Through this presentation, we intend to explore the two models of disability rights, how they are implemented through real-life case studies, and how the model that is accepted by a country may affect their outlook of disability rights, as well as their support for the UNCRPD. So what is the UNCRPD? The United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities was an important turning point in 21st century disability and human rights discussion. It was adopted on December 13, 2006 at the UN's New York headquarters and was opened for signatures on March 30, 2007. This convention came about by decades of efforts of the United Nations to modify the attitudes and approaches towards people with disabilities. The UNCRPD shifted the views on persons with disabilities from that of being charitable objects that require assistance from the state to that of people with rights who are capable of claiming those rights and making their own decisions in their lives, as well as being free and active members of society. The UNCRPD looks at the categorization of persons with disabilities through an inclusive lens that encompasses and reaffirms all type of disability as being inclusive in the protections of human rights and the fundamental freedoms. So why is this convention so significant? With 82 signatories to the convention, 44 signatories to the optional protocol, and 1 ratification, this convention set the record as reporting the highest number of signatories of any UN convention on an opening day. This convention was special as it was the first comprehensive human rights treaty of the 21st century and the fastest negotiated human rights treaty overall. The convention itself includes 50 different articles outlining the rights, freedoms, liberties, and security that all persons with disabilities are entitled to as human beings. Just for reference, here's a map of the CRPD and optional protocol signatures and ratifications as of 2017, obtained from the United Nations website on the UNCRPD.
The social and medical models were the two disability models that were continuously used by states and academics. The implementation of the UNCRPD is building upon the social model and recreating the disability rights paradigm. So, what is the social model? The social model initially came out of the United Kingdom. The social model has been one of the most popular models used by scholars and human rights activists for a few reasons. The main reason was the definition of disability. Within the social model, the definition of disability and impairment are separated. This is to demonstrate how it is not a person's impairment that makes them disabled, but the way in which society is structured, making the impairment disabling. Thus, being in a wheelchair or being blind would be the impairment, while the disability is society not providing readable material or only having steps outside of buildings. The social model dissects the way that social practices and institutions portray people with disabilities as useless or a burden on society, amongst other things, to the extent that society has implied that they are living a life not worth living. Which is why the purpose of the social model is to move society from treating people with disabilities as a defect to a society that is more inclusive. The UNCRPD recognizes the social model as recognizing that disabilities is an evolving concept and that disability results from the interaction between persons with impairments and attitudinal and environmental barriers that hinders their full and effective participation in society on an equal basis with others. It is important to note that there is a limitation with the social model. The social model aims at creating an accessible environment by minimizing the inconvenience of impairment. However, it does not equalize disabled people with non-disabled people.
We will now be moving on to case studies, and we're going to start with the case study for the social model. The case study we picked was the country of Thailand because Thailand has found a degree of success in enacting national law both alongside but also from the UNCRPD. Now, prior to the UNCRPD, there was a disability movement in Thailand. It dates back to around the 1980s, but Prior to the 1980s, people with disabilities were seen as objects of pity according to their past life. In this way, people with disabilities were seen as an object that kind of got in the way of society and the advancement of society. And because of this, people with disabilities were legally institutionalized in welfare centers. And as you can imagine, this severely restricts their human rights because they are now being taken in as wards of the state, and they have lost their own autonomy. But changes to this did occur through this national movement that was in Thailand, and this occurred due to a combination of civil society organizations, but also international volunteers. Now, from this, the Persons with Disability Empowerment Act, or the PDEA, was legislated in 2007, about a year after the CRPD, and this brought national law into alignment with the UN CRPD. Specifically, this new law updated the definition of disability as follows. So, persons with limitation in performing activity of daily living or restriction in social participation from personal impairment together with environmental barriers. And this updated definition, it indicates that there's a major shift towards a more social and rights-based concepts of disability that are more so in line with the UN CRPD. Now, this legislation, of course, isn't perfect, but Thailand's main advantage is the evolving legal frameworks operating in compliance with the convention, although further amendment is still needed, specifically including effective law enforcement. And this case study of Thailand demonstrates how international law, specifically the UN CRPD, influences global citizenship and human rights, as using the UN CRPD as a foundation enabled the government of Thailand to establish legislation that assure the dignity and human rights for people with disabilities, and to aid civil society organizations in changing societal views on disability.
The medical model introduces people with disabilities as the problem and looks for a cure for said problem. This model is popularly used in medical schools and research, however, the same can't be said for other areas. Although the medical model still remains important in some aspects, it does little to actually look into many of the issues that affect people with disabilities. The UNCRPD explains that people with disabilities have a right to health and to rehabilitation, which requires research to be done by the state. The issue with this, though, is that the focus of the research would be on fixing people with disabilities rather than looking at external factors. Policies based off the medical model rarely recognize people with disabilities as having the ability to live a fulfilling life because of their disabilities. Due to this, these policies are focused on continually attempting to improve a person's physical or mental state rather than looking at the public issues surrounding the person. These issues can be environmental barriers in society or providing support for the person to properly exercise their rights. With this, it could be argued that because of the way that the policies based off the medical model excludes people with disabilities by looking at the person as the problem, it goes against equality that is present within human rights treaties. However, it is oftentimes counter-argued that these policies are the interest of the rights of the person rather than the person themselves.
So just to look at a real-life example, the United States is one of the countries that has traditionally looked at disability through the lens of the medical model. In 1990, the Americans with Disabilities Act, or the ADA, was enacted as a civil rights law to prohibit discrimination against individuals with disabilities in all areas of life. This included public life, jobs, schools, transportation, and all public and private places that are open to the general public. The purpose of this law was to make sure that all individuals with disabilities were granted the same rights and opportunities as everyone else. However, the Supreme Court's interpretation of the ADA has caused a sort of Goldilocks dilemma among those with disabilities. They are either too disabled to be considered a qualified individual for a respective job, or not disabled enough to be granted protection under the ADA. As was discussed by Earhart, very few individuals actually fit into the category of disabled just right. The meaning of disability has continued to be narrowed by the federal courts and especially the U.S. Supreme Court, further debilitating the ADA by seriously restricting the scope of who qualifies for its protection. Despite the ongoing trend towards a social constructionist idea of identity, and specifically a shift towards adopting the social model of disability among activists and scholars, society and the federal courts seem to have held on to the medical model as the dominant understanding of disability. Earhart believes that this could be attributed to the fact that disability and its theoretical underpinnings have not been investigated as deeply as other facets of identity like race or gender. He states that these underpinnings, and particularly the ways in which they have been represented in media, are critical and affect both the public and judicial perceptions of disability. As you recall, adherence to the medical model pushes forward the perspective that disability rights are special and can be granted, not something that is needed or a basic human right. This allows the perception that a person's disability is their own personal misfortune and an individual problem. Of all people, Clint Eastwood was sued for access violations of his Mission Ranch Hotel in California. After spending nearly $7 million on renovations, he had failed to make the parking lot and washrooms accessible to individuals with disabilities. This resulted in a lawsuit and the beginning of his attacks on disability rights in the United States. The importance of this case is less about the lawsuit, but more about the way that he was portraying the ADA and persons with disabilities to the public. As a large public figure, Eastwood was claiming that the ADA was a failure, that disabled people were getting way more than they deserve, and that private businesses should not be forced to accommodate people with disabilities. All of these statements are in alignment with the medical model paradigm of disability in two parts. Firstly, he publicly ignored and downplayed the societal barriers of living with disability, and secondly, his attitude focused on disability as an individual problem and not his responsibility. While this may seem unusual, as a celebrity, Eastwood had a lot of influence on the public's views, whereas there was no widespread public voice in favor of the rights for people with disabilities. Individuals were only hearing one side, which was Eastwood's. Sadly enough, a few years later, Eastwood acted in a movie, The $1 Million Baby, in which the message that certain disabilities may make life not worth living was portrayed. In this movie, a woman is trained as a boxer and is very successful until she breaks her neck and becomes a quadriplegic. The woman gives up her will to live and begs Eastwood's character to euthanize her, comparing herself to a sick dog that needs to be shot. Eventually, Eastwood's character unplugs her ventilator and injects an overdosing amount of adrenaline into her IV to kill her. It has been argued that his involvement with this movie was just a continuation of his attack against the ADA and disability rights. So this is just one representation of the way that the acceptance of the medical model is manifested throughout the United States. Many more can be found throughout scholarly articles surrounding the topic of disability rights. The main point suggested by Earhart about examples such as Eastwood and the movie The $1 Million Baby is that the public's perception of disability is largely influenced by what it sees and hears in media. These portrayals matter and contribute to the interpretation of disability that is embedded in culture. If one can understand this, then it's not that surprising that the federal and Supreme Courts have also adopted the medical model of disability, focusing on the limitations of individuals with disabilities and their application of the ADA. The process of application to the ADA for accommodations in the workplace requires four things: proof of disability. Secondly, the applicant must be qualified to perform the duties of the position. They must have requested reasonable accommodations, and lastly, the accommodations must not cause the employer any undue hardship. The sad part is that the last two requirements rarely even come up due to dismissal of whether or not the individual is considered to be disabled and whether or not they are qualified for the position in the workplace, hence why we have the Goldilocks dilemma. The bounds of the definition for disability in the United States, centered around the medical model of disability that focused on impairment and not the social bounds of disability, are the cause for the majority of applicants not receiving accommodation and the weakening of the ADA. In his second part of his discussion on disability rights in the United States, Earhart suggests an amendment to the ADA that would widen the scope of definition for disability rights to dismantle the Goldilocks dilemma. Not long after the UNCRPD took place, in 2009, the Americans with Disabilities Act Amendment Act, or the ADAAA, was signed into law, making a number of noteworthy changes to the definition of disability. However, interestingly enough, the United States was one of the countries that was not initially supportive of the UNCRPD, and although 175 countries have ratified the convention, to this day, the United States is still not one of them.
Now we will tie the concepts of global citizenship and human rights into the UNCRPD. The first point being that the UNCRPD ensures that persons with disabilities are treated with dignity and that their human rights are recognized by both international and national law. One thing that I took from the case study in Thailand is that a goal of the UNCRPD is to leave no one behind. And I think that line is very important to global citizenship as a whole. I think the idea that no one should be left behind helps inform one's views on what global citizenship is. The second point is that, like the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, the UNCRPD is an inclusionary document that provides an entry point for policy development regarding a specific demographic of society. One thing that came out of the UNCRPD is as nation states began to recognize the UNCRPD, disability activists themselves were able to radically challenge citizenship status and practices, and that policy and social provisioning regimes have been required to respond to disabled people not as exceptions, but as a part of the political community. Now, the third point ties directly into our class. A couple weeks back, we read the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People as part of the class. And one thing that really struck me with the document is that it strives for Indigenous autonomy. And in a way, the UNCRPD also strives for the autonomy of peoples with disabilities, in that there's something that can't be relegated to the side of society or viewed as an object. Rather, as I said before, they are a specific demographic that can't be left behind. And I think that's something that ties back into just the idea of global citizenship and human rights in general, in that instead of pushing people to the side, specific people, rather they need to be incorporated and included in society. And lastly, our fourth point is that the concept of global citizenship is linked directly through the international recognition of persons with disabilities, and the UNCRPD was created through collaboration between national civil society organizations and the international community itself. In conclusion, the UNCRPD is an international document that upholds the human rights and dignity of people with disabilities. The convention itself includes 50 different articles outlining the rights, freedoms, liberties, and security that all persons with disabilities are entitled to as human beings. As was previously discussed, the debate between the medical and social models continues, with the UNCRPD taking the side of the social model in rebuilding the disability rights paradigm. The UNCRPD is crucial to discourse on human rights and global citizenship, as it ensures the rights of people with disabilities, but also ensures that no one is left behind.